which Sahabi looked the most like the Prophet ﷺ. So you have to remember some names that we covered. There are certain people that resembled, that had shabah of the Prophet ﷺ, they resembled the Prophet ﷺ most. So who can name some names? Ja'far radiallahu ta'ala anhu. The first person is Ja'far ibn Abi Talib radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And Ja'far, very beautifully, the Prophet ﷺ said, Ashbahta khulqi wa khalqi. That you resemble my khuluqi wa khalqi. You resemble my character and you resemble my creation. You resemble me the most in how you look and how you act. What a compliment. And the Prophet ﷺ sent him as the ambassador to Najashi, to Abyssinia. What better representation of the Prophet ﷺ than his cousin, who resembled him most in his looks and in his character, in his khuluq and in his khalq, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. So first you have Ja'far. Who else do you have? Mus'ab ibn Umair. So I'm going to hold Mus'ab off for a bit, inshallah. Let's start only with the family of the Prophet ﷺ. All right, so only with the family of the Prophet ﷺ. So first you have Ja'far. Who else from the family of the Prophet ﷺ looked like him? Not necessarily. He's not listed min shabih Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from someone who looked like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Anyone else? It wasn't too long ago. Al-Hasan wal-Husayn. May Allah be pleased with them. Al-Hasan radiallahu anhu from above, Husayn radiallahu ta'ala anhu from below. Right? So Al-Hasan resembled the face of he looked so much like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that you have the famous narration where Abu Bakr picks him up radiallahu anhu and throws him into the air, and he says, you look more like your grandfather sallallahu alaihi wasallam than your father Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So Al-Hasan wal-Husayn. So you have Ja'far, Al-Hasan wal-Husayn, and there is one more from the family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We covered him. He's so interesting. He was one of the most interesting characters we covered. Anyone remember? Abu Sufyan ibn al-Harith. Abu Sufyan ibn al-Harith. If you go back, we did a lecture on Abu Sufyan ibn al-Harith radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. He gets lost because people think you're talking about Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, the very famous Abu Sufyan. Abu Sufyan ibn al-Harith was the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, who looked exactly like him, and he was the Prophet ﷺ's best friend growing up. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ was so hurt, remember, by his abstaining from Islam. And initially when the Prophet ﷺ came back, he didn't want to look at him. He was so hurt by him, right? Because of how much he hurt the Prophet ﷺ. So he came to the Prophet ﷺ begging for forgiveness and stood with the Prophet ﷺ in Hunayn, and the Prophet ﷺ was so happy to have him back. Like imagine your best friend and your twin, your look-alike from your childhood and your family, and now he comes back to you. So you have Ja'far, Al-Hasan, Al-Husayn, Abu Sufyan ibn al-Harith, and then you have Qutham, who we're going to talk about inshallah ta'ala. Qutham, the baby of Al-Abbas, the youngest child of Al-Abbas. And the scholars will debate about which one of them looked the most like the Prophet ﷺ, and some of them said it was Qutham, who was the most identical to the Prophet ﷺ in his appearance, but he was a baby, so he grew up afterwards. So you saw that shabah, you saw that resemblance more so after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, right? When he had to grow up into being an adult. The two that were not family, that looked like the Prophet ﷺ, one of them was Mus'ab ibn Umair, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, and the other one was who? Uthman ibn Affan radiyallahu anhu. Uthman. So when the Prophet ﷺ saw Ibrahim alayhi salam on the night of Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, he saw him in the heavens, and the Prophet ﷺ told his daughter Ruqayya that no one resembles your father and your husband more than him, Ibrahim alayhi salam. Right? So Uthman radiallahu anhu also had a shabah. He had a resemblance to the Prophet ﷺ. So again, you have Ja'far, Al-Hasan, Al-Husayn, Abu Sufyan ibn al-Harith, Qutham from the family that look like the Prophet ﷺ, and then you have Mus'ab and Uthman ibn Affan to an extent as well. And it gives you some context as well that the two ambassadors of the Prophet ﷺ, one to Abyssinia was Ja'far, the one to Medina was Mus'ab. So two of those who actually look like the Prophet ﷺ were actually his ambassadors sallallahu alaihi wasallam when they went out. And that's why in the Battle of Uhud, when Mus'ab radiallahu anhu fell, they thought that they killed the Prophet ﷺ. Some of the enemies started to cry out, قَتَلْنَا Muhammad ﷺ, we killed Muhammad ﷺ, because they saw Mus'ab fall and they thought that that was him alayhi salatu wassalam. So those are the ones who resemble the Prophet ﷺ.